and welcome to All 24 News Exclusive. I'm your host, Marwa Belaiber. Today, as Africa positions itself at the heart of the global digital transformation, critical questions are emerging around artificial intelligence, data governance, and digital sovereignty, all of which will define the continent's role in the future of digital order. In this exclusive conversation, we speak with one of the key architects of global digital cooperation, Amandeep Singh Gill, United Nations Under-Secretary General and Special Envoy for Digital and Emerging Technologies. Mr. Gill, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Welcome. So, Mr. Gill, let me start with a broader picture. How do you assess Africa's position today in the global digital landscape?
Africa's position, from my perspective, is critical. I have a lot of optimism about Africa's role in the digital future. Africa's got 20% or more of the global talent overall, and this share is going to grow. Africa's economy is diversifying. The financial inflows are shifting in focus from overseas development assistance to investment, foreign direct investment, and the domestic economy, the startup economy is maturing. So Africa is poised to take advantage of the digital transformation.
And is Africa shaping the rules of digital future, or maybe still adapting to frameworks maybe defined elsewhere?
I think that's been the case so far, but with the adoption of the Global Digital Compact in September 2024, we now have a place, a table where every country has a seat. For example, on the governance of artificial intelligence, all 193 member states, including all 54 of African member states, will have a seat at the table. So this is an opportunity to be seized. Of course, this requires building of capacity and investments in the critical enablers for the digital transformation, without which participation cannot be meaningful.
Actually, true, yeah. So the United Nations has been advocating for more inclusive digital cooperation. So what concrete progress have you seen when it comes to Africa's participation?
Take these new mechanisms on artificial intelligence governance that have been decided by member states. So the Independent International Scientific Panel on AI of 40 experts from around the world who will come together to assess the impacts of this technology, the opportunities and the risks. 7 of these 40 members are from Africa. So these are scientists, African scientists, who work with AI, with data on a day-to-day basis, and they will contribute to this global assessment. Likewise, the Global Dialogue on AI Governance in July 2026, this year in Geneva, and then next year in New York, would see participation from African countries. The work they are doing on governing data themselves, on seizing the opportunities and managing the risks of AI can be highlighted there at this dialogue, and Africa's inputs can then shape the shared governance of these technologies for the entire globe. I think the most important point is, and I emphasize this in my participation here at the Global Africa Tech Conference, that Africa should not be just a consumer of technologies, governance frameworks that are developed elsewhere. It should have agency, it should shape the development of the technology and its governance in accordance with its own priorities, with its own needs.
So we can say that we will see more Africans involved in technologies and participate.
Absolutely.
Okay, so artificial intelligence is evolving faster than regulation. So from your own perspective, are we already falling behind in managing its risks?
I wouldn't say so, because if you take this narrative that somehow technology is moving very fast and the governments are never going to be able to catch up, then that disempowers us. We need an empowering narrative. Of course, the pace of the technology is very fast, but governments, civil society, the private sector still have agency and can still shape the direction and the outcomes of this technology by taking a wise position with regard to managing its risks. So, for example, protection of data, personal data and privacy, the governance frameworks for that, but also the misuse of artificial intelligence in areas like deep fakes, misinformation, disinformation, and also some of the safety security issues that we see with AI systems. These require active involvement of public sector authorities. Also, in terms of the development of artificial intelligence, governments can take a variety of measures to stimulate more comprehensive development of AI and to have more companies participate in the development of this technology.
So talking about AI, should AI governance be global, or do you see room for regional approaches, and particularly for emerging economies?
The two can coexist. So there is a layer of where the global action, digital cooperation as we call it, can be consequential. I mentioned the scientific panel on AI for these shared assessment of the technology's impact and potential. At the same time, this dialogue, which can help bring different perspectives together, build interoperability across different governance systems. But we cannot decide everything at the global level. There is a consequential layer at the national and the regional level, where nations and regions have sovereignty over how they want to develop AI, how they want to regulate it. And obviously, there's another layer at the private sector level, at the level of researchers and developers, where some self-regulation, some ethical approaches can be useful. But again, we can't say we just leave it to self-regulation. So all these three layers, the global layer, the national regional layer, and the private sector developer layer, have to move in complement to each other.
Okay, so yeah, so many countries want to control their own data and also infrastructure, but they also want to attract global investment. Where should the balance be, and what is non-negotiable in this?
This is a great question. I think every country will have to find its own balance, every country, every region, according to its level of maturity in terms of digital infrastructure, in terms of participation in the digital economy, but also in accordance with its own aspirations for the future, because we cannot take the present for a fixity. So finding the right balance is something that every country must assume its responsibility for. Where is the sweet spot? I think you need a minimum level of data infrastructure for storing some of the sensitive data sets, for example, national identity, health data, some of the other data that can be sensitive from any nation's perspective. But at the same time, you need, on other types of data, some interoperability. Regulated access domestically and internationally so that data can flow and contribute to the digital economy. So we cannot just wall off data, but we cannot also not assume our responsibility for building the minimum data infrastructure. To take Africa's example, today Africa has less than 1% of the world's data infrastructure. And it has 20% of the world's population. So there is obviously a huge gap. There is headroom for that capacity to grow in Africa.
Yeah, so speaking about infrastructure gaps, what should come first? Connectivity, data, or infrastructure, or even digital skills?
I would like to say all of them. Because we no longer have the luxury to say, I will build the physical connectivity, physical infrastructure first, then I will train the people who are using it, and then I'll think about data infrastructure, data flows, and after that I will start to build artificial intelligence, AI models, and applications. I think everything has to be done at the same time within, of course, the limitations of resources available. We have found at the United Nations a few enablers of a faster development and faster digital transformation. For instance, the digital public infrastructure approach, where the supply side of digital infrastructure, the connectivity, broadband, mobile connectivity, meets the demand side of digitally enabled services at the societal scale, which acts to accelerate inclusion in the digital economy. So there are ways now to run all these races at the same time. Every country, for example, on AI does not have to build frontier models. It can take open source models, tune them on local language and other data sets, and then start developing the applications that make most sense for it.
Yeah. True. While we speak on Africa, so how can African countries avoid over dependence on a handful of global tech companies while still benefiting from their innovation?
By investing in their own infrastructure, digital infrastructure, by investing in the talent, especially cross-domain talent across agriculture and AI, health and AI. Also coming out with the right policy frameworks for the development of AI and also the kind of protections that are needed for data, for example, and I mentioned some aspects of misuse of AI. A critical role can be played by the fast tracking of applications in the digital economy, because that's where you can create the startups. That's where you can create your own companies that can coexist with the big tech, with large companies, large multinational companies, find the niches, the areas where these companies can develop, can exist, and over a period of time, reinforce the participation of national companies, domestic companies in the digital economy. So you don't have to choose. I think big tech is bringing important benefits in terms of its platforms, also in terms of infrastructure, some of the submarine cables that are being built by big tech companies, and Africa can leverage these and must leverage these while developing its own domestic startup and other ecosystems for the digital economy.
Moving to Algeria here, so Algeria is trying to invest, or it's investing heavily in digital infrastructure. So and it is also positioning itself as a regional hub, let's say. So how do you assess its potential role in that specific area?
No, I'm very impressed by the progress that Algeria has made. So 90% plus of the population has 4G coverage. The share of 5G coverage is rising very fast, 300,000 kilometers of optic fiber for broadband, and many other areas in which infrastructure is being built out. And then there is the impressive talent. I had the opportunity this morning to sit with some startups from Algeria. So that talent is there to see, and some exciting companies are building value by using this infrastructure, but also the new tools, new possibilities are available with artificial intelligence. Algeria has another advantage, which is access to low-cost energy. I think that is a critical enabler today. Many other countries are struggling with it. A critical enabler of the deployment of AI infrastructure, the compute infrastructure that's needed to train AI models. Of course, there are areas in which progress is possible. There is still a gap. All of Africa, including Algeria, has access to a very limited number of GPUs, chips for training AI models. So these areas need attention, but overall, I'm very impressed with the progress that Algeria is making, and also the leadership that I see within the government and within the private sector. Young, enthusiastic leadership that wants to not only help Algeria, but also help the wider region, the African continent, to develop the digital economy.
And when we say Algeria and digital sovereignty, what does that mean to you? Or what's the first idea that you get in mind?
So digital sovereignty is a concept that I encounter frequently in my travels, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, even in North America. So we have to understand it as a desire to build, let's say, resilience, to build the domestic economy, and I think it is laudable. There can be no progress in digital economy if we don't have a degree of digital sovereignty. But sovereignty shouldn't mean that we discount interdependence. I think the internet is a global public good. Internet is a good example. It connects every country on earth, and it has provided the foundation for the development of a multi-trillion-dollar global digital economy. Likewise, data and AI are going to create tremendous value, economic value in the future. So we should try and have a mutually beneficial interdependence. It shouldn't be that many countries are just placed at the lower end of the value chain. They just end up being data annotators or consumers of products developed elsewhere. But interdependence would be important, and it can coexist with sovereignty.
And what about Algeria's efforts in converging all African technologies?
I think Algeria's leadership, what I've seen at this conference with regard to Africa's aspirations, Africa's needs, is commendable. It's contributing to efforts that other parts of Africa have also been undertaking. For instance, last year, the G20 presidency of South Africa put in a lot of emphasis on Africa's AI needs, Africa's digital public infrastructure, and data for development in Africa. So all these efforts are now coming together. There is the continent-wide free trade area and the digital trade protocol to it, efforts led out of the African Union Commission. So the frameworks for a continent-wide digital economy, which is interoperable, which gives scale to African entrepreneurs, those are also in place. I think what I've seen in the last 2 days is an underlining of the sovereignty side of it, the resilience side of it. And I think that is good news, because that will help policymakers to focus on domestic investments, what they need to do in terms of infrastructure, talent, policies, so that this is more of a homegrown digital economy without disconnecting itself from the rest of the world.
And what about projects in Algeria, like the Trans-Saharan Fiber Initiative, are often highlighted? These projects are often highlighted. So can initiatives like this truly reshape regional integration?
Absolutely. So this project that you mentioned, you look at Algeria, its neighbors such as Niger. So if a regional approach is taken, because Algeria has a huge territory compared with some of its neighbors, if a regional perspective, a collaborative perspective is taken, then this infrastructure becomes available for the whole region. If data governance frameworks are interoperable, then again, data can flow throughout the whole region and help entrepreneurs everywhere. So these projects are symbolic of the desire to weave the region together. The intra-regional trade in Africa is much lower than Africa's trade with the European Union, for example. So there is a lot of room to expand the trade within Africa. And today, globally, you see the digital aspect of trade flows is rising rapidly. It's one of the fastest growing parts of the global economy. So if we can build interoperability through these regional projects, if we can build a regional collaborative approach, as we've already seen, for example, in Eastern Africa, with M-Pesa playing a role in connecting payment systems across a number of countries, then it benefits everyone. It's a win-win situation. I see this not only in Africa, this dynamic, but also in ASEAN. I was recently at the ASEAN Digital Ministers meeting, and they've adopted a master plan, which kind of simultaneously brings forth work on digital interoperability of infrastructure while advancing the trade element within the region.
So, going back to infrastructure, Algeria's investments in technological infrastructure, let's say, it's huge. So for the how the United Nations could make them reach and match with the African Union investments, and also maybe in the scope of the 2063 agenda?
Right. So the United Nations works very closely with the African Union Commission. So we have a dialogue at the level of the chairperson of the AUC and the Secretary General of the United Nations. There is a new college-to-college arrangements, and digital technologies, energy and infrastructure are part of that college-to-college arrangement. And the African digital agenda is very much aligned with the Global Digital Compact adopted at the United Nations. So I see this convergence at the level of the strategic frameworks, at the level of the leadership. Also, the vision is very similar, not to leave anyone behind and ensure that Africa participates fully as an equal in both the development and the governance of these technologies. So how can the investments be catalyzed? I think when you have this kind of a global alignment, when you are participating in these global conversations as an equal, then obviously the interest from the private sector, from other partner governments, to work on the basis of that alignment is much higher. And we already see that, if you look at the European Union's engagement with Africa, the engagement of other partners from around the globe, it is advancing rapidly. I mentioned some of the interests that we see among the global tech companies from all parts of the world to invest in connectivity in Africa, bringing submarine cables to Africa. And now there are initiatives to bring a large number of GPUs, chips for training AI models, to Africa. So African companies working with American companies to bring those chips to Africa. So we are at a good moment on this.
There are also concerns that AI deepen inequalities. How do you prevent a new digital divide, particularly in Africa?
This digital divide is a reality with regard to connectivity, where we have 2.7 billion people that are not on the internet. But deeper down, there is an energy divide, 600 to 700 million people, a large number of them in Africa, who don't have access to assured energy supplies, electricity. So we have to prioritize these investments, these baseline foundational investments. We also have to prioritize, as governments, as international organizations, investments in the next generation of digital infrastructure. I mentioned the potential of digital public infrastructure, which can lower the costs of bringing digital services and goods to large numbers of the population. So we have to have smart investments, not throw money, large amounts of money, at physical infrastructure without building the demand side. If we work on both, then the multiplier effect is much more. So there are many ways in which we can boost the infrastructure spending and bridge the divide.
Okay, so if you had to identify one major risk for Africa in this digital transition, what would it be?
To end up being a consumer of these technologies without contributing to their development. So ideally, I like to see in the next few years a lot of action that positions Africa as a major developer of AI application solutions, not only for Africa, but for the rest of the world. For this, governments in Africa have to take action now to build the infrastructure, including the data infrastructure and the AI compute infrastructure, to build the talent, to develop the data sets, local languages, local problems, data sets around that, and then finally to put in place the right policies, the right frameworks, especially for the private sector, the startups, to work with those other pieces, talent, data, and infrastructure, to build the applications, to build the solutions.
So finally, Mr. Gill, are you optimistic or concerned about the direction we're heading when it comes to global digital governance?
I always remain optimistic on these issues despite the challenges. Last 2-3 years, we've seen a lot of progress at the global level on digital cooperation. We are facing some headwinds, of course, with geopolitical competition, with competition around technology, and also some challenges to multilateral institutions themselves. But I'm confident that we will overcome these challenges, because these challenges are transboundary. No single country, no single institution can handle them alone. And they are about the future of humanity, both the opportunities to solve many long-standing problems of development, but also the risks where AI, as a very powerful technology, can pose very systemic risks to the world's stability, to peace and security, and to our development challenges. So this compels us to collaborate internationally, in multilateral institutions. So I'm very optimistic that wisdom will prevail and we'll continue to work together.
So, Mr. Amandeep Singh Gill, you are the United Nations Under-Secretary General and Special Envoy for Digital and Emerging Technologies. You are with us on All24 News. Thank you so much for speaking to All24 News.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, dear viewers, this was All24 News exclusive interview. Thank you very much for watching. This was your host, Marwa Belaiwer.